Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Barely any other individual in German history is as controversial and as often talked about as he is. To many conservatives, Bismarck was, and remains, an identification figure. For almost 20 years he was the Chancellor of the unified German Empire, which he played a huge role in creating. He was a skilled diplomat who knew how to play out his enemies against one another and was very successful at it, but only after waging 3 almost consecutive wars. He created the most progressive social security system of its time, but he detested the social democratic movement and unsuccessfully attempted to suppress it. He was pragmatic, calculated and a staunch conservative, but he often erupted in bursts of emotion. So, as you can see, Bismarck was a highly ambivalent man, and today this seemingly great statesman finds himself under a lot of criticism. One reason for that is the recently emerging discussion about Germany's colonial past. Though German colonial rule had only lasted for 3 decades, countless crimes were committed under it, and those were largely just swept under the rug in public discourse up until a few years ago. Now this painful chapter slowly emerges again. In summer of 2022, the German government had agreed to return 22 so-called Benin bronzes to Nigeria. Those works of art had been plundered and stolen by the British in 1897 and then sold off to various museums and private collectors. The Ethnological Museum in Berlin alone has about 530 of these objects in its possession. During a restitution ceremony in the Nigerian capital of Abuja, the Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party said the following: "We are here to right a wrong. This is a history of European colonialism, a history in which our country has played a dark role." In this colonial debate, Bismarck began to appear more and more, even though he initially was a staunch opponent of German imperial ambitions. Still, after the Congo Conference of 1884 and 1885 and the establishment of the German colonial empire, he became a key figure of sorts. When in 2020 and 2021, the statues of various colonizers and slave traders were torn down in England, some voices called for the same thing to occur in Germany. Let's take the monstrous 34-meter tall statue of Bismarck in Hamburg, for example, which is currently being renovated. The fact that a considerable amount of money is being spent on the restoration of this controversial figure made a lot of people very upset. As a compromise, the History Museum of Hamburg has launched a competition among international and national artists called Rethinking Bismarck to figure out how to transform the monument into more of a memorial. The winner of this competition will probably be revealed in the coming months. For some, this still isn't enough, and they see in Bismarck the personification of imperialism, racism, warmongering and anti-democracy. In July of 2020, some 120 protesters gathered in front of the statue and chanted, "Otto must fall." Another recent controversy was the decision of the Foreign Ministry to rename one of its meeting rooms from Bismarck Room into Hall of German Unity, and to remove the portrait that had been hanging there. Alexander von Bismarck issued a statement saying, "We, the Bismarck family, are appalled and unspeakably sad that our own history and our country is treated like this." Gerhard Papke from the liberal centre-right FDP wrote, "The fact that Bismarck, as the founder of the German Empire and the Foreign Office, is declared persona non grata under Baerbock is not only an expression of lack of culture, it represents the Greens' brazen attempt to reinterpret our country's history in their own terms." But not just conservatives and people who position themselves on the right-wing spectrum criticized the renaming and the general attempt to remove Bismarck from the public light. Take Wolfgang Thierse from the Social Democratic Party, for example. He was the president of the German parliament in the early 2000s and contributed massively to the decision to rebuild the Berlin Palace. Thierse accuses the Green Party of committing history cleansing with moral furor and of attempting to free themselves from historical burdens. He argues for a reflective view of Bismarck and says that individual people can renounce their heritage, societies, however, cannot. Personally, I find myself agreeing with him. A critical discussion and historical reappraisal of Bismarck and Germany's Prussian heritage is long overdue, but you don't achieve this by simply removing everything you dislike. However, I also strongly disagree with people who claim that he was some national hero and who constantly attempt to highlight Bismarck's good side by bringing up his great achievements outside of their historical context. While researching for this portion of the video, I've had to scour through dozens of newspaper articles. This was not always an easy task, because most German newspapers openly follow a certain political stance, which makes it difficult to get a coherent and clear picture of complicated events and discussions. And that's where today's sponsor Ground News comes into play. Let's say you are interested in German politics, like I am. So all you have to do is enter the term into the search bar and immediately dozens of interesting stories pop up. This story, for instance, was covered by 20 different news outlets with various different political leanings. As you can see, most coverages come from the centre, and the vast majority have been rated as highly factual. It even shows you who's behind certain newspapers. These evaluations were made by 3 independent news monitoring organisations, so you can quickly drill down into a story to find out what's really going on. Ground News makes it easy to compare different headlines and see how language is used to convey a certain picture of current world events. You can expand your knowledge and gain a comprehensive understanding of the media landscape by being able to see all sides of the story. I firmly believe that it is important to step out of one's own political bubble and find out what the other side has to say, so this tool is absolutely phenomenal for making this easier than ever. You can try it out for yourself by heading over to ground.news/Serenade and benefit from a special offer of 30% off their Vantage plan, which helps support my channel and gives you an opportunity to have unlimited access to Ground News for as little as $5 per month. Be that as it may, I find this debate highly interesting, and while I was reading some newspaper articles, I kept wondering, how did we get here? Was there a time where Bismarck was really idolised? How was he seen in German society throughout our history of many diverse forms of government? Well, join me on a journey through 100 years of public memory. On the 30th of July, 1898, Otto von Bismarck died in Friedrichsruhe at the age of 83, after having suffered from a terrible illness. Only a few days later, more than 1,000 people dressed in mourning clothes met in the Oper in Berlin to attend Bismarck's funeral. Throughout the entire country, countless other, oftentimes excessive, private funerals were held, while the official ceremony, reserved only for the most exclusive, was largely ignored. In the 1900s, Bismarck began to pop up everywhere. Statues were built, streets and public squares were named after him, towers were erected, and postcards with his face were being sent around. Those buildings and monuments were usually financed with public donations. He was praised in newspapers, brochures, and books as the most German of the Germans. 400 cities made him an honorary citizen. There were pilgrimages to his residence, and his birthday became an unofficial holiday. Even abroad, you were not safe. In German East Africa, a Bismarck statue was built by German colonists, and an archipelago in Southeast Asia got renamed after him. There is even a fish, a sparkling water, a palm tree, and a liquor named after the guy. There were plans to build a gigantic and quite frankly megalomaniac Bismarck memorial in Bingerbrück, but due to the outbreak of the First World War, its construction never happened. This is interesting and surprising at the same time, because Bismarck hadn't been exactly popular among most people when he was still alive. After all, he was an authoritarian who disliked any form of opposition, and his domestic policies against Catholics and the Social Democrats didn't earn him a lot of friends, as you might imagine. So where did this change of heart come from? The answer lies in the very disliked Kaiser Wilhelm II. Many wanted to express their disdain towards the emperor, but feared that they would be decried as unpatriotic. So instead, they began to praise his biggest adversary, Bismarck. Initially, it was mostly academics and intellectuals who expressed their feelings this way, but the sentiment quickly swept over. Another reason for the sudden celebration is the pride in the newly created German Empire. After all, it was Bismarck who forged it, and not the Kaiser or his grandpa. It was not difficult to praise this man, because during his lifetime he had known how to present himself. He often portrayed himself as the personification of Germany, with his height, his Prussian uniform, his facial expressions, his boots, and of course, with his Reichshund Tyras, he created a very distinctive iconography that turned out to be very appealing to many patriots. They saw in him the personification of Germany and began to feel a certain sense of pride. Not in him, mind you, but in themselves. So this adoration of the Iron Chancellor went hand in hand with the almost fanatical increase in nationalism that led up to the First World War. What's important to remember is that they were not glorifying the actual Bismarck, but rather a mystical and fanatical version of him. When the war broke out, in 1914, the Bismarck myth played a big role in how German soldiers perceived themselves, because oftentimes they felt like they were defending his heritage. Many Bismarck biographers and historians jumped on that bandwagon too. Horst Kohl, for example, published a propaganda leaflet called At Home and in the Field with Bismarck in 1915, which became a sort of Bible for some. In the same year, Max Lenz wrote an essay called The World War Mirrored in Bismarck's Thinking, in which he argued that it had been envy on the side of the Entente powers against the created German Empire, which had incited them to start this war. November 1918. The very first united German democracy was proclaimed in Berlin, and it received its republican constitution very shortly after. The Social Democratic Party and those who supported it wished to completely turn away from the imperial Bismarckian state. When Austria-Hungary disintegrated, some expressed their desire to finally overcome the lesser German solution and unite with Austria. In a speech at the opening of the German National Assembly in Weimar in February of 1919, President Friedrich Ebert gave the following speech. German Austria must be united with the motherland for all time. They belong to us, and we belong to them. I may well express the expectation that the National Assembly will authorize the future government of the Reich to negotiate as soon as possible with the government of the German Austrian Free State about the final union. Then there shall no longer be a border post between us. Then we want to be a united people of brothers. Why this sudden interest in Austria? Ebert and the Social Democrats hoped to legitimize their government by proving that they were capable of fixing the historical error that Bismarck was accused of making, and that the Republic was upholding old German values. They often emphasized that the German Empire under Bismarck had been incomplete. However, the Allies at Versailles saw things differently, and Germany was forbidden to ever unite with Austria. This gave many right-wingers and conservatives an ideal target to spread their propaganda. In the emerging radicalism that engulfed the Weimar Republic after the signing of Versailles, the democracy, the lost war, and the social democratic government were seen as direct consequences of the alleged stab in the back. The stab in the back myth was a conspiracy theory which claimed that the German army had never been defeated on the battlefield, but was instead betrayed by treacherous elements at home like the Social Democrats and the Jews. This myth was always heavily intertwined with the Bismarckmythos, because the traitors against the army were also traitors against Bismarck and his empire. This conspiracy theory and this Bismarck myth weren't just spread by some delusional lunatics, but also by the largely conservative and nationalist historians of the time. Take the Bismarck biographer Max Lenz, for example, who also claimed that it was in fact the greed and the cowardice of the Republicans which caused Bismarck's glorious empire to collapse. It was only when the will of power began to flag Bismarck's creation, and with it the power of the nation. We must never pass by indifferently or in stupid optimism. Always think of it and always speak of it must be our slogan. The right-wing anti-democrats used all of the technological methods available at the time to evoke a sort of nostalgia for Bismarck. The goal was to make the claim that Germany could only survive if it was led by a singular, strong individual instead of this un-German republic. Let's take the 1925 film Bismarck, for example, which was split in two entries. Cinema had become a mass phenomenon after World War I, and many filmmakers saw them as an opportunity to shape the public's perception of history. This movie did not have the intention of portraying Bismarck accurately, with all his strengths and flaws, but instead it wanted to propagate national values and wake up the soul of people and show them what they have lost. And so he was portrayed as an always calculated man, without any weaknesses or personal doubts. The Bismarck myth gained even more attention after the devastating economic crisis of 1929. Many saw the Republic as unacceptable and instead wished for a strong leader to get them out of their predicament. And one person who portrayed himself as the second Bismarck more often than anyone else was Adolf Hitler. When he had still been rather insignificant back in 1922, he said the following to a small crowd. "We must walk in Bismarck's footsteps. Only in this way can we win millions of voters. And when the time comes, let us say, we bow our heads before you, Bismarck." This is surprising because he never desired to go back anywhere near close to the old political structure before 1918. Instead, he saw the desire for many Germans after a charismatic, authoritarian leader and wanted to fulfill that desire and create a sort of bridge between his party and the old conservatives. In 1931, he said at a party conference speech, "If Bismarck were to return today with his companions, they would all be standing with us." Now, it would be nonsensical to claim that it was the Bismarck myth that catapulted Hitler into power, but it is still remarkable how he managed to present himself as his new saviour when many Germans wanted to get rid of their democracy. While Adolf Hitler often talked about Otto von Bismarck in the years following up to his taking of power, he remained very much silent about him after 1933. The only time he ever mentioned his name publicly, apart from a few small exceptions, was in February of 1939, when he gave a speech during the christening of the battleship Bismarck. But the dwindling interest of the Führer and of all the other high officials doesn't mean that the topic of the Iron Chancellor became irrelevant to German society. Instead, newspapers like the Völkischer Beobachter praised Bismarck for his achievements, but often criticized his domestic policies and his failure to create an all-German state. So, a continuation was drawn up between him and Hitler. On the 40th anniversary of Bismarck's death, the Völkischer Beobachter writes, "When others were still looking for salvation in a weak, thoughtless back to Bismarck that was alien to the meaning of history, he, the Führer, took the new path that leads beyond all errors to a better future for all Germans." What was often praised instead were Bismarck's colonial policies, and sometimes, if rarely, similarities were drawn between the National Socialist colonization plan in Eastern Europe and the overseas colonial empire. In parts, you can also see a small increase in criticism regarding Bismarck's policies towards the Jews. You see, Bismarck's decision to sign a law emancipating the Jews in the North German Confederation in 1869 was accused of having led to, unquote, Jewish rule in Europe. So Bismarck could not be used for their anti-Semitic hate campaign. Shortly after its outbreak, the Second World War was sometimes equated to the Wars of Unification. In April of 1940, just before the start of the Battle of France, Hitler said, "Just as Bismarck's empire emerged from the year 1866, so the Greater Germanic Empire will emerge from today." When German troops took Paris, the newspapers were filled with euphoria. The victory over France was seen as the most glorious in German history. In their eyes, Bismarck's achievements were exceeded. However, Bismarck was only really exploited during the first few years of the war. After 1941, the presence of Bismarck in the public light decreased massively. The reason for that can be found in the war against the Soviet Union. There was simply no historical precedent regarding Bismarck in Russia, which is why he became largely irrelevant. Only the foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, later used Bismarck as a kind of justification after the war. In his own words, he claimed to have supported Bismarck in diplomacy against the Soviet Union and to have attempted to dissuade Hitler from Operation Barbarossa. After the end of the war, Bismarck was seen in a much more differentiated and critical light. Oftentimes, a direct continuation was drawn up from him to the Nazi regime, and he was accused of having laid the groundwork for the rise of dictatorship. Konrad Adenauer, would-be Chancellor, said in 1946 that Bismarck had turned the state into a false idol and strictly positioned himself against another Germany under Prussian leadership. He was supported by his federalist Bavarian party colleagues who wanted nothing more than to distance themselves from Bismarck and to forget the painful memory of subjugation under Prussia. Theodor Heuss, who would become the first German president, strictly opposed the continuation theory. He did criticize Bismarck and his domestic policies often enough, but also called him a builder of German statehood. In 1947, he condemned the planned renaming of streets named after Bismarck and said, "One can engage in intellectual polemics against Bismarck, and he still remains the greatest political phenomenon in Europe in the second half of the 19th century." Even after West Germany was created, the ambivalent opinion of Bismarck remained. For the West German politicians, Bismarck was not exactly relevant in their everyday lives. He was not used to delegitimize the new democracy like it was often done in the Weimar Republic. In 1965, on Bismarck's 150th birthday, a post stamp was released in his honor, and a small celebration was organized in the Bundeshaus in Bonn. Even the 100-year anniversary of German unification did not lead to a new radicalization or even a questioning of the democratic order, which is quite remarkable considering how differently things looked just 5 decades earlier. Now, what about all those monuments dedicated to Bismarck? Most of them had survived the war and had not been torn down by the Allied powers. However, they stopped being a site for pilgrimages, either because of a change in mentality or out of fear from consequences. all monuments have their own unique history, so let's just focus on one particular example in my hometown of Göttingen. Göttingen has 3 different monuments: the Bismarck House, the Bismarck Tower, and the Bismarck Stone. In 1965, the Social Democrats and the Liberals in the City Council voted to demolish this unpopular and questionable Bismarck Stone and replace it with a memorial dedicated to the victims of National Socialism. Many inhabitants disapproved of this decision and began to collect signatures. Many didn't understand why the monument had to go and claimed that it was not a good site for a memorial of such magnitude. The last point is fair enough because the Bismarck Stone is located at the very edge of the city. Initially, the council tried to justify its decision, but the public pressure turned out to be way too high. And so, the Bismarck Stone was not torn down, but instead renovated. As this example shows, the interest of the German public in Bismarck was still quite high in those years, even in a more leftist city such as Göttingen. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Bismarck's image changed throughout the decades. Immediately after the creation of the GDR in 1949, it wanted to legitimize itself and defame the West through the means of history. The so-called theory of misery was highly popular in the 1940s, and it painted a picture of German history in which the socialist GDR was the only beacon of light after centuries of war and suffering. This theory was supported by countless historians and even Walter Ulbricht himself, and it quickly made its way into the East German schoolbooks. Prussia was vilified for its apparent militarism and its unjust social structures. Bismarck became a personification for the old system, and he was targeted as such. In his book Irrweg der Nation, or The Nation's Wrong Way in English, the historian Alexander Abosch finds very harsh words for the Iron Chancellor. He criticized the German unification as a reactionary Prussian takeover. Quote, "Through Bismarck, however, Germany became the Holy German Empire of the Prussian nation instead of a modern state. The consequences of this false fulfillment of the German desire for unity were bound to be the downfall of Germany and the world." He also denounced Bismarck's policies against Social Democrats and Catholics. This theory of misery was only short-lived, and just a few years later, the regime moved away and into a different direction. In the 1960s, a more ambivalent discussion was generally held about Bismarck. He was still criticized to pieces, don't get me wrong, but his actions were interpreted differently. The unification of Germany was seen as a necessary evil that, in the eyes of contemporary historians, made it possible for the working class to organize themselves. In the 70s, he was once again demonized for paving the way for the National Socialists. The theory of misery just wouldn't leave the minds of many, even if the doctrine had officially been abandoned long ago. This can be explained by the fact that the GDR gave up its aspirations for German reunification at that time, and wanted to distance itself from West Germany even further. In the 80s, the perception changed once again, and this time you could almost say that Bismarck was almost portrayed in a positive light. The reasons for that are not quite clear. Some argue that the chronological distance and the relative prosperity of the 80s made it possible to adopt a more relaxed attitude towards Prussia. Others argued that the increasingly apparent economic problems forced the regime to find a new identification figure for the average GDR citizen. It was no longer argued that there was a direct continuation between Bismarck and Hitler, and his diplomatic skills towards Russia were even praised. The historian Ernst Engelberg published the first book of his Bismarck biography, and to the surprise of many in the West, he painted a very favourable picture of the Chancellor. He commended his social policies and praised him as a talented politician with an iron will. With that, however, the SED regime lost a portion of its legitimization. It had always claimed that it was the superior form of government compared to the West, that allegedly never learned anything from its history. The new image of Prussia created a slight sense of community between East and West Germans, and for many it created the hope that Germany would once again reunify, which it finally did on the 3rd of October 1990. Alright then, dankeschön for watching the video, and I hope you've learned something. If you did, a like and a subscribe are always appreciated. A very special and grateful thanks goes out to A Cup of Tea, Drix, and Tristan Kriegsmann for their generous support over on Ko-Fi. You are fantastic. Have a very wonderful day, and see you next time.